At Westerberg High, where cliques rule, jocks dominate, and all the popular girls are named Heather, it's going to take a Veronica and a mysterious new kid to give teen angst a body count. Today, we cross the T's, dot the I's, and count the bodies, and figure out what it all means. This is Michael Lehmann's subversive and sardonic 1989 classic, Heathers. And now, our feature contemplation.
Speaking Cinema with Andrew Schwarz.
Welcome back to the Speaking Cinema Podcast. This is season 3, and I'm so happy to be back on the air, and I'm so excited to be with you guys and for you to join us and listen to us. And we got so many good movies queued up for you this season. It's going to be great. So we are starting with a hell of a cool movie that I had never really heard much about until our special guest, who I'm going to introduce in a second, had mentioned it to us. But right before we get to that, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, Speaking Cinema Podcast, and of course our Instagram page, which is Speaking Cinema Podcast as well. We always release what we're going to talk about in terms of the title about a week before we drop the episode. So make sure that you follow us there and subscribe to us on YouTube, Speaking Cinema Podcast. So it's great to have you guys, and it's great to have this guest as we talk about Heathers, this wild, crazy, very, very relentlessly interesting movie. It makes me laugh, it makes me cry, it makes me feel all sorts of crazy things. And we're going to talk about why that is. But first, let's talk about who we're going to be doing that with. You know him, you love him. He's returned many times on this podcast because I absolutely love talking to him. He's a great guy to boot, but he knows so much about cinema, and he has so much to contribute every time. I can't help but have him on again and again and again. And here is again, for all of our pleasure, Adam Seccafico. Adam, filmmaker Adam Seccafico. Thank you for coming back on the podcast, sir.
We could, sir, are a couple of sick fucks who love sick fuck movies like this, and
Right.
only you and I can tackle it. So yes, I'm very happy to come back, and I'm very happy to subject our viewers to such madness.
Me too, and I'm glad that you are. We have that in common, and that's why we're opening the we're not even just covering this thing. We're opening the season with this thing. So it's like, take that, listeners. Take that, audience. Fearless over here.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Coming soon, season 4, Pink Flamingos. That's what we're opening with.
Hey,
Teasing that up.
Don't put it past me. We will
Don't
do
put it past me. I'm the sick fuck who came on the Saltburn episode and say, yeah, I watched that movie casually. That is boy, I had a long day at work. What am I going to do to unwind? Pink Flamingos. That's my unwind movie.
Sure. Your unwind move that even goes, I think, beyond me a little bit. But yeah, we do love subversive content, transgressive content. Like we covered Bad Lieutenant. Oh yeah, and we'll pretty much cover everything as long as you guys will have it. But not rise up with pitchforks and flame torches at our houses. But Pink Flamingo. That there are certain movies that it's just like, wow, to unwind with those movies, you have to be a very special, bearded, long-haired, sort of, but yet smart person. And,
a movie Jesus, if you will.
Right, and I'm none of those things. So no, I'll leave that to you. But I love Pink Flamingos. I think that John Waters, Adam, would probably have he's probably seen this a million times. He probably loves this movie.
I'm fairly
kind
certain
of up his alley.
I'm fairly certain he's hosted 1 or 2 retrospectives on this movie, like some sort of like an evening with Heathers at this university or this theater. I'm sure if he hasn't, then he should get right on that, because this feels like it's indebted to Waters to some extent. Yeah,
it just has that kind of feeling to it. And it's rare for a movie to have that kind of feeling because it needs to be really ballsy and like forthright about itself. It has to go where it's going fearlessly into the valley of shadow of death, and just not make any bones about it. You can't make a movie like Heathers or like those movies that we were just talking about without really going all in and putting everything into the service of that style and that tone and that crazy what the hell's going to happen next atmosphere. But it all means something here. I think it might mean different things to different people. And I think that's what our job is here on this podcast. We really focus on the meaning of movies here, and I think a way that no other podcast does with movies. Sometimes they dip into it, but I like to really pick these guests' brains about what these images and what's happening in these themes, what they actually are saying to us, the significance of it, whether culturally, personally, academically, and so on. So we're going to get into the thick of it here, Adam, but I'd like to ask you first, like I've been asking everyone in season 2, this movie, I want to know what makes Heathers an Adam Seccafico selection. Or at the very least, we don't cover all movies on this podcast, of course. It's kind of a specific type of feeling, I'll say. Not even necessarily type of movie, but it's a type of feeling that we, the guests and the hosts of this podcast, get when we see something or think of something that ends up being part of the pipeline, right? There's a special shimmer, there's a shine, there's a glow to a movie. I think now that we've done this for a while, can you describe why this one, and alongside that, what makes this movie important enough to you as a person to want to cover it on this podcast?
It's funny because of the films that we've done so far, this is the one that I have probably the least sentimental attachment to, which is funny because it's a film I saw back in high school. It's a film that I had an interest in, and a film that I'm sure blew my mind when I was 16, 17 when I watched it for the first time. But like most films then, it kind of just slips into the ether and kind of goes away. The reason I picked this film was because you and I, back when you were living in Hawthorne, kind of always had this fun little one-upsmanship game together. You would show me a really messed up film. We'd both sit there and we'd analyze it as we do on this podcast right now. And then the next week, I might bring something over to you, be like, I just picked this up at FYE. I don't know what it is. I just heard that it got banned in Germany or something like that. And we watch it together. And Heathers, I had forgotten certain elements of it, but I knew this was the kind of film that is subversive on such a level that I knew you and I could just have a feast about it. And I also knew that back when you were living in Hawthorne, back during the height of the pandemic when we were just trading movies back and forth, this would 1,000% be a film that I would have brought over to your apartment and went, guess what? Clear the calendar. We're going to go to Villa Roses first. I'm going to have my meal. You're going to have your meal. We're going to come back. We're going to pop this in, and we're going to talk about till about 5 o'clock in the morning. And then I'm going to be like, shit, I got work. I got work in 2 hours.
Villa Roses. Yeah, our own like small town routine, like getting slushies in the movie or something.
Exactly.
That's what we would do. And then we'd watch these psychotic, crazy movies and talk about their meaning for 5 hours. Yeah, those were the good old days. So yeah, there's something special about it. I think that not everyone would appreciate and enjoy these movies as much as we do. But I really hope that what we can do here is try to give this movie its moment on the airwaves in such a way where people can, even if it's not their movie, we could really appreciate what the movie means to us, people that really, really love the movie, and maybe expand some consciousnesses out there a little bit to some different perspectives and see what exactly it is that makes this movie ring in terms of meaning to be that movie that would make you want to bring it to my house and watch it together.
Exactly.
Right. It's like, what is that shine?
Correct. And it's also, again, the key of the film is to kind of look beyond the frame, look deeper into it. And this is a film that, this is a film that is a classic cult film. It didn't quite connect when it came out in 1988, 1989, around that period. But it had a very growing following. The two leads of the film, Winona Ryder and Christian Slater, went on to be movie stars, like very big movie stars of their time. Yeah. This movie had admittedly a failed FX show back in the late 2010s, but this also has an off-Broadway play going on right now. Heather's the musical,
Yes.
essentially.
Yes, it
So
is.
while this film is not necessarily unknown, it's a cult film and it has a very loyal, very passionate cult. Films like this, you don't talk beyond the, oh my God, that moment was really fucked up. Or, oh my God, I can't believe they got away with this.
Yeah.
Or, oh my God, I can't believe so-and-so agreed to do this film, even though Winona Ryder and Christian Slater were known for being the two kind of weird movie stars of their time who
Yes.
would do weird offbeat projects. But I digress. But this podcast allows us to be like, all right, there's clearly something that resonates with this audience. What is it? And I feel
Yeah.
like this movie, obviously, when we're going to get to it, has a lot of meat to the bone as far as the social commentary is concerned. But it's also a very personal film, if you think about it. It's all about characters, this film. This is one of those that,
Yeah.
the story is terrific. The social commentary is terrific. I hate doing the whole like, oh, back they don't do it like they used to. It's like they don't do. You can do it however you want. I'm not a big believer in like you can't do anything anymore because somebody who's a talking head in the making of documentary says you can't. I
Yeah,
believe
me
you
too.
can just make anything
Such
you
is
want.
art.
Just such as art,
Right.
precisely.
Yeah. I
But
mean, a lot of art, it does tend to be a reflection of the times anyway, right? And in
correct.
that respect, what are you saying? Are you saying that you want times to be exactly the way that they were? Well, then
No,
art would probably be very similar in a very boring kind of way, right?
but
So,
this
yeah. Yeah.
But the sad
This
fact of
is,
this movie is this movie, and you and I had discussed this. This movie should be incredibly dated. This movie should be
yeah.
oh man, the 80s, let me tell you something. But yet, how
Yeah.
prescient the film was, not just in terms of, again, unfortunately, violence perpetrated in schools,
Yeah.
but just this kind of ongoing malaise that feels like it's now just become accepted in the norm.
Yeah.
I feel like where it's just like it was cool at one point to be kind of hip and like, fuck the system, man. And now that fuck the system is permeated for 40 years, now just it's kind of crusted over to where you wish this movie was dated, but then you go, okay, no, this movie is actually very prescient.
Yeah, and that was the shocking thing, and that's actually a good segue into just the next simple thing I want to talk about. I mean, my first watch of this movie was last week. I've watched it like a few times before we're recording this, but you just mentioned a little bit earlier that you had seen this when you were a teenager, when you were like maybe the ages or not very far from the ages of the characters in the film. So it's just really interesting. I think I don't necessarily have a question for you, but just for everyone out there listening, Adam watched this movie for the first time when he was a kid. This was like, over 15 years ago. And I watched this movie for the first time like a couple weeks ago. So I think our perspectives might be a little bit different as to like the personal aspects of the movie and how because when you watch a movie when you're much younger, I feel it sort of bakes into you and it keeps fermenting inside your head, and you eventually start to live more, right? You experience more. And when that happens, you watch the movie again and you think about the movie, and then the next thing happens and you watch the movie again and you think about the movie, and the movie doesn't change, but you do. And then your perspective on it does change. So I guess maybe I will ask you real quick, has your perspective on the movie changed at all since you first watched it? Because
Oh yeah.
I don't have that window to examine, but you certainly do. So briefly tell us about that before we get into the weeds of meaning here.
I am a little embarrassed to say that the character of JD talked to me a lot when I was 17 years old.
Don't be embarrassed. I think that's just being 17, right?
But in a weird way of like, there are still elements of your personality that do ring true when you're 33 as well as you were 17. So
Sure.
watching it now, I'm sitting there going, I know you're full of shit. I know you're 1,000% full of shit, but you make a compelling argument. Please stop
Yeah.
making a compelling argument. You're making me question a lot of stuff about myself right now. But it's weird because I'm also somebody who I hate people who be up on youth culture. I just do. I mean, For the simple reason of its low-hanging fruit, and when your life is literally a Cronenberg movie, when you're going through puberty, that's
Yeah.
punching down for me. That is absolutely punching down.
That is such a good way to put puberty. It's so
Exactly.
nerdy, but it's so dead
Oh,
on.
yeah.
Please continue.
But that's so. I'm sure when I was 17. But yeah, I did see the world the way that JD saw it and the way that Veronica saw it, where everything's so superficial, man, and all these clicks. It's a lot like how society functions, man. And now I'm like, all right, there's an element of truth to that in an odd sort of way. Like high school prepares us for, like, I guess, certain social settings
Yeah.
more than anything else. But again, when you're 17 years old, you don't know shit.
Yeah.
You may have some idea. You may know that maybe things aren't. You learn to question authority more when you're of that age, and you should question authority more when you're that age.
The only
problem
thing
is,
yeah. No, keep going.
is I feel like we carry that forward into life more, where you feel like you question everything just out of habit, as opposed to kind of going through life and then just having a good bullshit detector. So when you're being lied to, all right, I know I'm being lied to, as opposed to assuming I'm being lied to all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue.
That's
I feel
so
like,
true. And for any, if there are any younger or teenage aged listeners out there that are hearing that, I while I do agree with that, I think that definitely seems very scary. If you were to tell that to a teenager or a younger person now, like, oh, eventually you're going to have to develop your own bullshit detector, and you're going to be able to, you're going to have to make all these decisions, and you're going to have to know what's real and what's not, and what's bullshit, and you're going to have to act, and you're going to have to inspire and influence. And I think that is very overwhelming to hear. It's even overwhelming for me to hear now, and I am more adult in doing that kind of stuff. But as right as you are, I would just like to assure any younger listeners here, or anyone who's young of soul, but our age or older, that it's just something that I think comes naturally.
yeah,
You
it
don't have
does.
to worry about it being your active job. Like, oh, this is my duty to make sure that there is no bullshit. I have to screen here, and I'm going to apply that skill right now. Boom! You can't do that. So it's just something that you acquire when you go through life, right?
It does come naturally, but it's also, I'm trying to pick my words very carefully right now.
Always.
You should always speak truth to power when it's the most difficult to do so. And it is very difficult to do so sometimes.
Right.
But by that same token, don't always assume that people in power are there to just fuck you over constantly.
Right.
Because in actuality, like, this is going to sound even more morbid to a degree, like, live your life. Nobody's out to get you specifically. They're not. Because in the grand scheme of everything, we're all part of this great big tapestry, and not one single thread kind of stands out amongst all the other threads to get pulled on just because.
Yeah, that's good advice. And tune in for the next episode of Adam Seccafico Informs You About What to Do in Adult Life.
Yeah,
Vital information with
By
Adam
the way, I
Seccafico.
should be subscribed to that, because I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing most of the time either. So
yeah, exactly, right? We always help other people the way we would have helped ourselves earlier on. Hindsight's 2020, ain't it, pal?
Jesus. Yeah.
But that's a really good way to bring us into takes here, because I want to find, before we start going into the deep weeds here of the movie itself, I want to know, Adam, what you think this movie boils down to in terms of meaning, significance, or what it's saying, what it's trying to tell us, the voice of the movie, so to speak, right? We always like to do this. Tell me what you think that this movie boils down to and what it means, and then I'm going to tell you what I think it really is, and then we'll get into it after that.
In so many words, never let your id drive the bus. Control your id, as hard as it might be sometimes. As much as you want to give in and just let your animalistic self just run amok on a school or something like that, you need to learn to control it, because eventually your id is so powerful that it will take over your life. And then once it's, in control of your life, it's very hard to reel it back in. as it were.
Yeah.
And I do think that JD does function very much as Veronica's id. You think about that introduction, and all of a sudden, here's this weird, mysterious, kind of cool guy who's just as smart as you, who's on that same wavelength. The difference is he's just maybe 10% crazier than you are. And he'll
Yeah.
act on those things that usually you wouldn't act on. So I absolutely think that JD is Veronica's id, and we'll talk more about the id when we talk about the Heathers, the titular characters, in a nutshell. But as far as if you want me to boil it down to what the movie is exactly, I believe it's that. You do not let your id drive the bus.
That is an amazing explanation, take, and explanation of your take. I think that's just like dead on. I think if you told Daniel Waters that that's what you got from this, the writer of the movie, the screenwriter, I think that he would just he would slowly hug you, and pull you in closely, maybe even a little caressing of that beautiful hair that you have, because the writing is so good, and it's so tight, and it's so meaningful, and it's so sardonic and funny, but powerful, that I think that sometimes it's difficult to see what you're talking about through all of these like weeds of weirdness and craziness that makes up this movie. So yeah, I think that's amazing. I give you a virtual hug on behalf of Daniel Waters and Michael Lehmann, the director. I think, Adam, I probably thought a little bit less psychologically like contained within like a person's psyche for my take, and more of I think a little bit large and zoomed out. But I think that it's sort of like I call it a look at limbo. You have Drive the Bus. I say this is a look at limbo. I think it's like the in-between stages of life. This is like the more literal thing. Those in-between stages of, high school, typical kind of after childhood, but before adulthood, right? But what the movie does is I think it takes that entertainment value, literal kind of landscape, and it extends it outward into commentating a lot about the limbo of civilized society, right? It's like after where we are in society right now. It's like after this medieval barbarism, right? But it's before cultural maturity that you could sort of define as, let's say, mutual respect, that kind of liberal compassion and selflessness. Right? It's not that, but it's also not absolute barbarism. It's somewhere in the middle, and because there's so much static and weirdness and strangeness and odd behavior that colors that space, and it sort of takes like a snapshot of what the high school version or the high school level of society on the maturation curve is like, and it just takes that to the nines with the satire. So that's what I think that this movie is.
It's funny too, because you mentioned, that whole mentality. It's also about, if you want to think about it this way, Veronica, it's about a person relearning how to feel for others. Speaking of that kind of selflessness coming about.
Yeah.
Because at the beginning of the film, Veronica's, kind of abandoned this one friend, Betty, to go hang out with the Heathers. You can still feel like she's feeling terrible about having abandoned this one friend. And yet it's one of those slow things of, as everything starts to unravel, not only does she reconnect with that one friend, but she kind of helps save the life of two other people in the film.
Yeah.
As time progresses, it's like almost like relearning how to feel for others. Which, again, when you're in high school, is a very selfish time. I mean, life's a very selfish time, but in high school in particular, it's considered a very selfish time. You're out in it for your own. It's about picking the right social group. It's about picking the right whatever. Of course, I lack these skills completely, so high school was a very long experience for me, but I digress. But it's about, to your point, learning that selflessness and climbing out of that limbo, at least for Veronica.
And I agree. And yet, even though I agree, I have to acknowledge, again, kind of on behalf of those younger listeners out there, or people that remember very clearly what it was like to be at that age, I remember how infuriating it was for me to hear older folks, by that I just mean older than me, anyone older than I was, talk about in this sort of, self-righteous way, which, oh, it's just a time that you're learning and you don't know exactly what adulthood is and you don't know anything and all these things that are quite condescending.
Oh yeah.
But I totally acknowledge that and I remember that. But I feel like I'm going to hitch my wagon to what you just said anyway. The reason being is that I don't think I think it's inescapable.
Yeah, it is.
In high school, I think no matter what you do, because you're caged in with these creatures roaming around and taking all these different strange forms and strange personalities and weird social dynamics and everything, you can't, even if, let's say that you're a high schooler who there are high schoolers that I know are listening to this podcast. I have piano students that I know listen to this podcast. So I know I'm speaking to them. I think even if you listen to podcasts like Speaking Cinema and other podcasts that have guests that talk about intellectual things and things that are of a higher consciousness, and so you're enlightened more than all of the folks that are roaming around and mindless slaves to whatever trend it is next, but you're above that because you're listening and reading and learning more than they are, and so on. Even if you're doing all that, which I fully endorse, I think that you can't escape these challenges anyway. And I think the film does a good job of showing that.
It comes with the time period in which that is in terms of maturity.
Yeah.
And I'll say this to the younger viewers too. You guys have it a lot more figured out than we did, because you guys, at least it feels like you have some sort of a culture around you. We didn't get that. We had to, or at least, and look, I'm projecting here. I'm sure there was a teen culture for me. I just didn't appreciate it or like it. Hence why I went backwards to find movies like Heathers.
Yeah. Because
I felt like we were kind of existing in this kind of post 9/11 haze where all the adults were hiding under tables, like begging, just please let the bad men go away. And we were kind of left to fend for ourselves. Meanwhile, we were also being told that we were the worst generation and you guys are just the terrible, like a blight on civilization. And we're just like, we're trying to figure shit out, dude. Calm the fuck down. Yeah. So at least you guys know this. You guys have it better than we did. I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. And honestly, good for you. And keep doing what you're doing, because honestly, I think you're going to do a lot better than we did. Yeah. Ultimately.
Well, that's a really nice, hopeful message. I feel like it's very difficult to know exactly where you are in the context of modern history, or the zeitgeist when you're in high school. And it's also hard to, equally so, to judge, I think, what current high schoolers are, what the predicament is in the context of the greater culture. When you're looking in hindsight, after 15 years of living, every single generation, really does, I think, have its own flavor of what this film is dealing with. Strange social dynamics, politics being mixed in, but not even necessarily big global politics and ethics. It's more like the politics of your personal world. Right, yeah. Because you can boil it down to finer and finer and finer details. Right, when it comes to the politics of being this age in high school, you can say, "Oh, it has to do with what president we have." Like that's a big one. Then you boil it further down to, "Oh, you know what? It actually depends on the mayor of our town." Boil it down further. No, it really depends on our superintendent, because the school district is XYZ. Then it depends on your principal. Then it depends on what pop music is out at the time and what trends. Then it depends if social media is good or it's bad at the time. Like milk, is it good or bad? I don't know. We keep going back and forth. We still don't know.
We kind of do.
And then it depends on your friends. And then it depends on your teachers. And then it depends on, what you want to do with your life and how you're splitting away or toward the friends that you had or the new ones that you're making. Everyone has their own story that they're writing or is being written about them by others. So it really is very personal. But what amazes me about this film, Adam, is just that it is so personal and is so different for everyone in terms of experience.
Mm-hmm.
But this film, I think, finds all of that stuff, all of that like nitty gritty, dirty stuff that we don't want to talk about, that does connect every generation at this age to the next and the next and the next. Like, it does such a great job of hitting bullseyes of just how, what it feels like to be that age and how to see the world and how it's so difficult to understand and difficult to understand your own predicament. And then on top of that, it makes this enormous case, which ties back into my take, that whole predicament to be in of not being able to quite control things and understand the world and everything, again, that extends outward to any society, any group, any tribe that starts to splice itself into different factions and start to compare and contrast and judge and all of the stuff that goes haywire. So I worship this film after seeing even just a few times. I really do, for this script and how it gets at the stuff that we can all say we experienced and we get it and we have things to say about it. Now let's get into it. Okay, now that we kind of know our takes here, I wanted to open up with a first topic of a simple game. It's the game of croquet.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, the game of croquet. I mean, this is how they open out the movie anyway.
They do.
Right? And they use this game, croquet, over and over and over again. And I just want to kind of say quickly what I think the movie is using this for, because I think it's a good kind of general device that the movie really, it capitalizes so well on it. And then I want to go further and further in from there and see what you have to say about this. Just even this first sequence, and then there are sequences that are kind of like it throughout, but the first one is actually sort of a dream sequence version of it, right? They're using this game croquet, which croquet is sort of like a status-y oriented kind of game, right? Like tennis.
Yes.
Everyone thinks, oh, tennis is so expensive, you need a court, you need a country club, you need to pay for lessons, which are right. So there's this sort of status kind of feel, high status to croquet.
Yes.
And these heathers that appear at the very beginning, and also Winona Ryder's character Veronica, they all do seem to have money, like they're high status, right? They're pretty, they have money, that whole deal. So they're playing this game croquet. But again, what this movie does, it takes the literal and it twists it and starts to commentate about greater society with it. So the game croquet is kind of like that high status game, like I said, but they start to play and they start to hit other characters' balls. And I believe the rules are when you hit another person's ball with yours, you get, it's kind of like the cue ball in pool. Like the person that is, I guess, the defense, or the person that didn't scratch gets to put your ball wherever they want. Well, if you hit someone else's ball, that's a good thing. You get to put, for your next shot, your ball wherever you want and take another hit. And what you can do is you can either place the ball right next to someone else's ball, and then you put your foot on your ball, and then you wind it back and you whack the thing so that you knock the other person's ball into outer space. So it makes it a lot harder for them to come back to their little arch in the lawn that they have to hit it through. Or you can just place it right in front of the arch that you have to hit it through, like a hoop going through a hoop. And then you hit it straight through the arch, and then bam, you're on to, win the game maybe that way. So the very first thing that happens, Adam, is they hit the balls, and we reveal that it hits Veronica's head.
Yeah,
and
which is just buried underneath the grass.
Buried underneath
from the
grass.
Down.
Yes. And then throughout the rest of the movie, they do things like the first Heather Chandler, I believe that is,
yes.
like Heather number 1 or whatever.
The superego.
The superego. You'll tell us more about that soon.
Oh, yeah.
She is playing with the other Heathers and, of course, Veronica, and she has this chance to place the ball for the other Heather number 2, I guess. And she's doesn't even think about it. She just places it right next to Heather 2, and she smacks the shit out of the ball, and the ball the ball leaves like the yard and goes into the dirt. And then Heather 2 is like, oh, that really sucks. Why'd you have to do that? So that kind of a thing. Why? And then Heather Chandler says, because I can. That kind of thing. And then later on, when Veronica kind of assumes the position of this sort of influential leader, or she's playing with Heather 2, Heather 2 knocks her out. Or then even later, Veronica is playing with her older friend Betty, right? And there's this interesting conversation they have about it, where Betty says, she's a very nice girl that Veronica used to be friends with. And she says, oh, you can just hit me out if you want. Like, why wouldn't you? That's the best way to win. And then Veronica says, not my style. She kind of looks like Ugly Betty, too, which is just kind of funny because Ugly Betty came out years later. Just a little bit. But anyway, and then Betty says, it's the easiest way to win. And then Veronica, of course, just says, all right, why not? And it turns out that she does it because she can.
Because she can, also because I feel like Betty feels like, listen, I know why. It's almost like she's forgiving Veronica for what she did to her. So like, listen, I understand why you did it. We can still be friends and hang out like this, but you're built different than I am. So don't let me kind of weigh you down. You could be more. And I'm kind of giving you the permission to move forward. I'll still be here. I'll still be supportive, and we're still friends. But don't be afraid to kind of knock the person's ball out because you can, and you are built that way. And don't let their lack of ethics control you.
Yeah.
In a lot of respects.
Yeah.
I think that's what that scene was ultimately boiled down to. Going back to the opening and, the wonderful visual of Winona Ryder's head just sticking out of the ground. And it's a great piece of grounding for the tone of the film, like right off the bat.
Quite literally. And
it also introduces, the Heathers kind of as this one functioning creature almost. Where it's like the three of them need each other and how they play off of each other. And I did talk about, again, the themes of the film, allowing your id to, kind of run wild. I do think, the Freudian trio is very much represented in the Heathers and that, they need each other. And the fact that Yellow Heather McNamara, who's kind of, in a lot of respect, the least consequential of the three, is the ego. She's kind of, she's still very much a Heather in that sense, but she's probably the most neutral, the most kind of sensible, for lack of a better term.
Right.
Then you have Heather Chandler, the red Heather, is the superego. She is the crazy narcissistic bitch who sits in judgment of everybody around, is kind of the leader, and is kind of, oh my God, I'm just going to trample over everybody. Then you have the late great Shannon Doherty as Heather Duke, the green Heather. And I think she is the id of the Heathers. In the sense of like, it may not seem this way because she starts the movie out so meek and so timid. And when we think of like the id and the id monster, as it were, we think of this bombastic force of nature that's going to go through every little thing. And just, again, we can mistake, Heather Chandler for the id as opposed to the superego. However, and I thought about this upon my second viewing of the film, all three Heathers have a sense of self-loathing to them, whether they project it or otherwise. And I didn't think about that until the scene at the college party when Heather Chandler takes Veronica to the college party to try and get, we're going to score some college guys and this is a cool thing to do. And it's kind of lame and sad and a whole lot of other things.
Yeah.
But the scene after Heather Chandler has sex with one of the co-eds, and she's in the bathroom afterwards, and she's freshening up, and you're thinking, all right, she's just freshening up. She takes a big old gulp of water, and she spits that water back out at herself in the mirror.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, you feel that self-loathing too. So, yes, I feel like as a result, I came to the conclusion that Heather Duke is kind of the id, and that kind of creates the trio as this one kind of Freudian unit, as it were. And I think that
Yeah.
opening scene does a good job of establishing that dynamic as well.
That's so fascinating to me that you thought about it that way, because it makes perfect sense when you explain it, of course. But just the fact that I didn't think about it that way until you explain it, and I now have to watch the movie for the fifth time or whatever it is, so that I can really think about all that, because that is brilliant. But yeah, for some reason I didn't think of the Heathers, the three, as like a three-headed monster with the same sort of body. In the Freudian way that you're talking about, I kind of thought about them as just this image of how all of these sort of high statusy, and not necessarily socioeconomic status. I mean,
No.
statusy as in popularity, the ultimate currency that I think dominates at the end of the day in the high school sort of landscape.
And here's the funny thing too, and I'll let you finish your thought, but there's also something about, because he said status, not just in terms of like statuses and, you know, who you are and what you represent and all this stuff, but like they represent in a lot of respects the status quo of that time, I think. And we'll get to that a little bit more, where it's like they're the thing that kind of controls the order and how it's always been to a degree.
Yes.
And you have Veronica coming in who is trying to fit into the order of things, but she doesn't quite fit into that as well as she maybe could.
Absolutely. And it also seems to be very much like, in that way, it's a sort of political or allegory for, reactionary versus progressive. You know, I think that's very strong there as well. That's implied.
It's a scene outside of the convenience store with JD where she almost makes it sound like they're not really my friends, they're like my colleagues, and our job is being popular and stuff. Yeah.
And of course, that's when she says, I don't even like my friends. And he says, I don't like them either. But I was just going to say, I thought of the Heathers more as like this image or portrait of the fact that all of these high popularity, high status girls or people, even though they're different, are generally interchangeable, right? Like almost like not that political figures are not consequential in their own right, but it's almost like a political office, or like a public servant's office, the office of the inspector general, the office of something else, where the established role is set, and agreed upon, and there's a rule book for it. It comes with a manual. This is what that person does. This is what the Secretary of Defense does. This is what the treasurer does. And then different people step into that role, and even though they have their own autonomy of thinking maybe about certain issues, and they have their own experience, and they bring ideas to the table, and they listen to people, and they might be leaning left or leaning right or whatever it is, but there's still something about the Secretary of Defense that's the Secretary of Defense.
The functionality of the position.
Right. You can draw a line from secretary to secretary to secretary through the functionality of the position. Right. And the functionality of the position is like, that's the purely administrative part of the thing. Right. That's this movie kind of separates the role of the thing from the person assuming the role. Right. The character of the person and even the intentions of the person. Because, and this is where all the political allegory, I think, goes crazy, especially when JD starts to convince Heather, whatever the second Heather is.
Heather Duke.
Thank you, Duke.
Shannon Doherty.
Shannon Doherty, exactly. When he convinces Shannon, it was Christian Slater, of course, in a brilliant performance, convinces her to do, through extortion, essentially, to have everyone sign the petition for their own debts. That's someone coming in and lobbying, right? And using that position in order to get what they want in the end, right? So that's what I mean by like, oh, the office doesn't necessarily have to do with the person. And that's where all the complications of bureaucracy and politics come in. But I think that the movie does a really good job of that.
It does.
And it's fascinating. So that's what I thought that these three Heathers initially were sort of representing. Like, a Heather is a Heather is a Heather. Yeah, Eventually, this one is more bitchy in that way. This one sort of empathizes for you a little bit in that way, but they have the same answer to similar questions. Why did you hit my ball out of the croquet yard? Why? Because I could. And she learned it from the other one. You know,
Yes.
She learned it from her predecessor. And all of a sudden, that learned behavior of what this position is supposed to be overtakes and trumps, for lack of a better word, the person that you were. You know, your critical thinking, your individual voice. It takes over and it vitiates all of the things that are supposed to be working independently, and it becomes just another ploy to get the thing done that's trying to be done, that's trying to get done, that's masterminded by some component that's not even part of the government, let's say. You know, no names. But there are always going to be people that do that, and businesses and other interests and things like that. And that's what I think is so clearly spelled out here through allegory, through this simple high school class and these simple students that could be kind of in any high school movie. But what he does with it is show you what the greater context is. And that's one of the ways that he does it. What do you think about that?
It's funny because he uses the faculty, I think, to really illustrate this point.
Oh, let's talk about the faculty.
Yes.
I can't wait.
Because if you think about it in that sense, while, you know, the students are kind of playing the game, I guess, that kind of socio-political game that you're talking about. The faculty
quite literally the game of croquet.
Quite literally, yes,
that's the illusion. That's the allusion to it. He starts with it and then starts to go social commentary with it. But yeah,
correct. But if you think about it, if they're only playing the game of croquet, you know, they're playing it because they had to learn it from somewhere. In that sense,
yeah,
the faculty is literally controlling the game in the film. They're the ones that, like, when everything starts kind of hitting the fan, they're kind of making decisions based on their own kind of standings and whatnot.
Yes.
And that's why Mrs. Fleming,
right.
Who's supposed to be the kind of the voice of reach. Again, she's a hippie. They literally call her a hippie, the other members of the faculty. But it's weird because, like, yeah, sure, she's acting like, I care deeply for these students. I care. In actuality, though, she's serving her own ends. If you think about it. You know, she's doing all this stuff when tragedy starts hitting to further her own agenda and to kind of become the driving force behind how the other students feel about it.
Yeah.
Again, while the students are playing the game, the faculty is controlling the game.
Yeah. It's almost like, because they are the authority of the school, right? They create the policy, so to speak. And I keep getting into political allegory, but it's hard not to.
Yes.
They create the policy, so to speak. They create the events. That teacher creates the event that ultimately paints how the students feel, like you said. So that is what they're doing, and it's also just done with so much, like, sarcastic humor. There's this one joke that I laughed at in particularly regarding the boardroom scenes of the faculty meeting to discuss what the hell are we going to do, what's going on here. I love, after that first murder of Heather Chandler, when Winona Ryder says, "Oh, she would never use the word myriad," and then Christian Slater is like, "No, she failed the test, but that proves my point further. Yeah. She's trying to, like, you know, be a better person or whatever."
She's wearing the badge of failure, and that's why she'd use the word myriad correctly in her suicide note.
Yes, the badge of failure. And it's just so, like, it's little moments like that create, I think, so much humor because they sneak up on you and you don't expect it. And then when it happens, it really hits you. So then in the boardroom scene, because they're kind of arguing before the boardroom scene, like when they're murdering her, you know, what are we going to do about the word myriad? All right, fine, put it in there.
Exactly.
And then that one teacher, it's like her only line, that teacher, that says it in, like, the whole movie. She's like, they're all serious, like, what are we going to do about this? And she says, I do really enjoy how I'm impressed by her proper use of the word myriad, though. You know, it's just like the performance of that, the way that they cut to it and then away from it so briefly. The rhythm of it. It was so funny to me, and I always try to think about like meaning in humor
Yeah.
and meaning in moments in not even necessarily like, oh, this entire sequence, this whole scene, this section, but like little moments in movies like this that make me never forget them. It's like when you're writing, you're thinking to yourself, I can put something filler in here, or it needs a little something, right? This scene, or I need to connect this scene to that scene. And I always think about that. Like those injecting that little moment is so important, when you're screenwriting, because every single moment has the opportunity to live on its own as an independent sort of like a facsimile of the main meaning, but it lives on its own, and you remember it. And I think that I always connect those moments in movies like this, and I draw like a map of the movie with moments that really get me. And that was one of them. The very first time I saw that, I was like, oh, that's brilliant. I love that.
I feel like humor ultimately is the thing that makes great social commentary. A lot of social commentary, a lot of people think social commentary is just literally a big old fluffy speech that's clearly the writer talking as the character.
Yeah.
And saying, this is the thing that I believe in by God, and I'm going to tell you right now. But the best social commentary is satire.
Sure.
It's cut with humor, because how do you get an audience to relate? It's usually through humor, through a joke that everybody's kind of thinking about already. But if you lay that joke in and you get it from the audience, they're already on your side a little bit more. Even if they disagree with what you're commenting on. At least they're there. It's like, all right, that was a funny line. All right, that was a funny moment.
Yeah.
And again, great social commentary, you have to bring people to you. You can't push them away.
Yeah.
And I do think Heathers is a great example, because it uses a very familiar genre, especially in the 1980s, which is kind of the teen melodrama, let's call it, for lack of a better term.
Sure.
And it's playing in that world where, if you saw a DVD of this film back in 2007, 2008, it had that high school classics insignia on it. And you're thinking literally, oh, it's like a John Hughes thing, right? Or something to that effect. In actuality, while, yeah, sure, it's kind of playing in that world, it subverts all those tropes incredibly well, and, presents a world similar to ours through high school, which is an experience everybody's gone through. It's a universal thing, but uses to comment on broader things in society. And as a result, though, it brings you in because you feel like, one, there's a degree of separation, because, again, not all of us are in high school currently, though it's a shared experience because we've all been through it.
Mm-hmm.
But it also uses humor. Dark humor, very dark humor.
Very dark.
And talking about subjects that are incredibly taboo. Murder, teenage suicide, general angst, manipulation of authority. But tells it in a way that, again, it brings the audience in where, hey, we can talk about it now because we have you on your side. And that's why, in my opinion, social commentary needs to come from a place of humor, first and foremost.
Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of shocking moments in this movie.
Oh, yeah.
Genuinely. Not even just because they're just objectively shocking, like, oh, it is shocking to watch a high school girl, pretty little cheerleader girl, drink Drano, choke up like her spleen, and then fall onto a coffee table, exploding it and not breathing anymore. Like, that was genuinely shocking to me. But also, just another layer on top of that is that this is a movie from the late 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Like, this thing is going on, 40 years old?
Thereabout.
And I'm just, and I'm just, it's 2025 now. I am not used to watching movies from the late 80s, teen comedies, like you said, the John Hughes kind of thing, Breakfast Club, and, Pretty in Pink and all that jazz. I'm not used to seeing this stuff in those movies. Like, you have an idea of those movies, right? They're very cutesy. She gets the girl or he gets the guy, and things come together, and it's ultimately this feeling like everything's fine, everything's okay, it all works out for everyone in their own little way. This movie absolutely crushes that. It demolishes it. It smashes it to pieces over and over and over again. In every scene, in every line of dialogue, it seemed like that was their main mission. And I just couldn't get out of the like shock mode at what this movie is doing. And that was, I can only imagine how insane and subversive that must have felt in 1989 when people were watching this in theaters.
I think I can now jump into what my point about, the Heathers representing the status quo could be.
Please.
Now, this is a very weird time in U.S. history. But yeah, Black Monday had happened, essentially killing the 80s as we know them pretty much stone dead a year before this movie came out. But yet there is this weird sense of like nobody knew what to follow it up with yet. Grunge was still kind of in its infancy and hadn't broken through to the mainstream yet. The alternative culture, which is represented in this film, through the potheads predominantly and a couple different fashion trends that feel more 90s and 80s, are kind of creeping in under the surface. But this kind of time period between like 1987 to like 1990, let's say, those kind of waning years of the 80s, I like to call the faded pastel era, where all those bright, vibrant colors are starting to lose their luster a little bit. Mm-hmm. And it feels like glop. Synth music is all of a sudden starting to sound like glop as opposed to once it was this pioneering sound. Mm-hmm. Fashion trends are starting to skew a little bit even more ridiculous than they had been, because it's almost like the 80s are clinging on to dear life. And the alternative movement of the 90s is starting to kind of catch up and it's nipping at its heels.
Right.
If you look at how the Heathers dress, they're in suits the entire time. They're in very 80s-y kind of suits.
Yeah.
They represent kind of that, the moral majority of Reaganism, holding on for dear life. Again, this is a status quo. By God's gotten us this far. And yeah, it might have hit a little bit of a snag, but it'll correct itself. And I think Veronica sees that to a degree and feels like, though I don't quite fit into this, maybe I'll try, even though it's Winona Ryder and you bring your own baggage, bring your own cultural relationship to a film. Mm-hmm. And Winona Ryder is kind of an alternative movie star.
Yeah.
In a lot of respects. So she doesn't quite fit in that sense. Christian Slater is kind of in the same vein, but he's almost like to the nth degree of that. Where he's the bull in the china shop. We have to go and we have to go now. We have to kind of bring this change about because, my God, it's gotten so stale. It's gotten so dull. And why are we doing it this way? We know this way is wrong. And he takes obviously too far. But in a weird way. And then you have the faculty who are, the baby boomers, not Gen X. And you almost have that, Miss Fleming again having her own kind of machinations of, again, I'm this, on the outside at least, a super kind of liberal hippie teacher, when in actuality, you're just into self-preservation.
Right.
At this point in time, like your entire generation is at that point. Trying to convince yourself, no, I'm still cool. In actuality, you're really fucking not, but I digress. I have a lot of issues with that character. Not issues in terms of performance, but just like in terms of like, again, character I dislike, but you're supposed to dislike.
But I was going to say, but is it accurately reflecting what the film wants to reflect to you?
It is. Absolutely it is.
Well, then props to it, huh?
Exactly. But to make a long kind of diatribe short, especially with that last shot, and we'll get to the final image, obviously, this movie feels like kind of maybe not the birth of the alternative movement, because like I said, grunge was starting up. It just hadn't quite crossed over. This almost feels like an opening shot of that culture war in a lot of respects.
I think that's very interesting. Yeah, there's so much truth to that. And it's, God, I just feel like if this were 1989 and we were talking about this then, I feel like it would already have so much meaning already. But then to be able to look in hindsight of modern history and just see everything that Adam was just talking about and seeing so clearly where the culture was going and what certain mistakes might have been made, right? It becomes, this is what we kind of started talking about a lot more last season, of meaning that the movie starts to take on that's outside of the script. And that is always so fascinating to me, because it like we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, the time period changes, we all change, but the movie doesn't change. And that that causes rifts, right? Like certain movies age and they just feel like dinosaurs and we can't relate and they're not
No.
relevant. And you feel like, "Ugh, I don't know what this is saying to me. It doesn't feel like it's mine. It doesn't feel like it's saying something to me about my life right here, right now." And that's bothersome, you know. But this movie is not like that. I think because of what you're talking about,
Like,
we can. It's repeating.
Yeah.
The history is repeating right now, like you're talking about.
I love those Jean Hughes movies, but I did not come of age during that time.
Totally get that.
I related
Same
very
here.
hard. I related very hard to Gen X growing up because I felt, with the exception of politics, I felt out of lockstep with my generation in a lot of respects. Because I do feel like we ultimately are going to be remembered, millennials at least, as we came down on the right side of things, the correct side of things, rather. But as far as like culture, yeah, exactly. But as far as like culture was concerned, I always felt closer to Gen X because I thought, these are the cool kids. My God, like, they had these great bands and this great art and this just, it felt like a cultural moment. And I felt like I didn't get one of those.
Yeah, I do have thoughts about that, but
And it's more my personal relationship to the film and kind of why I was watching movies like this. Because I was trying to fill that cultural void that I didn't myself, that cultural void that was within me, that wanting to belong to a movement in my own right. And that,
I think everyone does. And I think that actually explains why Veronica wants to, or it's implied because we don't actually know the exact details of it, but perhaps why Veronica wants to be the popular girl at the beginning. Like she wants to be part of the movement. But I guess my question to you would be, why does Veronica arc?
Here's the funny thing.
I want to talk about Veronica's arc.
I'm going to push back on it, on what you said, like her wanting to belong to a movement, because I don't think the Heathers are the movement. The Heathers are the status quo. It's like Veronica at the beginning of the film gave up on the movement. And it's like, all right, it is what again, you're typical, you always hear these words. It is what it is. I can't
that's
fight
fair.
it.
Okay.
And that's how I see at least where she starts off. Well,
that's the opening song is Que Sera Sera. What will be will be. That's kind of like they're giving, Waters is giving us right away, like, here is the song that is to be sung because, I want to ask my mommy, what am I going to be when I grow up? What's the future? What's the thing? What's the what should I do? What's my purpose? Right. And then it's like, I don't know.
You don't have one. Your purpose is to serve the status quo, which
I'll tell you what your purpose is. Go be you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean,
exactly.
That's basically what it is. So, but then my question is then, what is the movement? If the status quo is the Heathers, which I agree with you, what actually is the movement of the film and who is at the helm?
It's funny because I think JD wishes it was him, but he's too much of a maniac to sustain it. Because it's not so much a movement what he wants, it's anarchy.
Right. I was just going to ask you, is it like is he just a bad interpreter of what is he psychotic? Is the reason that he fails because he's psychotic?
Yes.
Or it's because he's a bad representative of the philosophy of the movement?
It's because he is essentially acting as Veronica's id, the thing that she can't control. Maybe he is the...
Yeah.
And look, it's one of those... he's an actual character. This isn't a Tyler Durden situation where she dreamed him up and, my God, he's me the whole time. But he's definitely an extension of Veronica.
Yeah.
And it's Veronica kind of... Again, JD kind of sees it as that. It's the old adage, a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah.
That's what I see JD as. I see him as somebody who's like, all right, guy makes some valid points, but at the end of the day, he's a psychopath who just is like, his whole solution to the problem is blow it all up, clean slate, start all over again.
Right.
And being somebody who is selfish and likes the idea of, living,
right.
I don't co-sign that idea. That is the bridge too far, as I feel like it is for Veronica.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity for us to go further into JD, because JD, I think, represents, I think in a sense, you're absolutely right, the id of almost any
Angry young person.
Angry young person, because in Veronica's diary, and Veronica doesn't strike me as a very angry person by default, right? She's stimulated, she's almost coerced into feeling things by external forces, right? However, when she does diary, when she does, have those anger fits, she shows that she's angry, and she mentions teen angst a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing with JD being the id is, I think you can almost say that JD is a sort of collective id for anyone that's young and sort of and learning and trying to get a handle on what the world is, and why not just burn it down? I think that is a huge question that is being contested with here, is why not just burn it down? And I think that we see that manifesting in all different corners of history. And even now, I'm so sad to say, right? In right now, in this moment, this is early 2025 when we're recording this. And it has been there my whole life. I see it everywhere. Why not? There's like this Nietzschean festering question that is, it's almost just, it's just on the surface of everything. Once you look and dig deep enough to kind of see under the hood of whatever compartment of society you're looking at, it's there. Like, why not? Right? And this ties into what you're saying that JD is, and I agree, it is that impulse to say, oh, why don't I just walk off that cliff? It's right there. Right. Let's do it. And you're right. That is so Tyler Durden. JD is Tyler Durden before Tyler Durden, and then Heather Chandler is Regina George before Regina George. I was totally thinking about that the whole time, especially on a first watch.
Absolutely. I mean, Mean Girls owes this movie so much, I feel like.
Oh, my goodness. For any of you guys that haven't seen the movie, how you've gotten this far into the podcast without seeing the movie, I don't know. But if you have, go see Heather's if you like Mean Girls, because this is where the damn thing came from. And or same thing applies to Fight Club. But Adam, how would you describe what JD actually represents, other than just an id? Like, is there anything beyond that, or do you think that's basically all he is?
I feel like that's basically all he is, because he doesn't have anything apart from his anger.
Right,
he is
blind. It's like blind fury.
Yes,
I remember when we covered Network, you said something about blind fury or blind anger doesn't work.
No.
Is that the same message that's being applied here? And how does Lehmann do it in this movie?
I feel like it doesn't, because at the end of the day, it's just going to lead to the road to ruin, as it does with JD at the end of this film. There is no other way for that character to have gone out than the way he did. Blind
anger, that is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Blind anger will only lead to your own destruction.
Sure.
I'm a big proponent of that and a big believer in that. And I feel like the way, because you were talking about Veronica's arc, JD is a character that the reason why JD, again, like I said, you can only describe him as an id, is because he has an arc. He is a straight line. Right. Now, your feelings on JD does change as the movie progresses, but that's because Veronica is arcing. Mm-hmm. He is there to kind of feed her arc, specifically because while, again, we start to grow kind of weary of JD, is because Veronica grows weary of JD. Mm-hmm. She starts to all of a sudden think to herself, like, I don't know about this guy. I thought I wanted this and it felt good, and I just wanted everybody in my school to get along, when in reality I didn't want this, though.
Yeah.
He's taken it way too far. Oh my God, my id is out of control. My teenage angst has a body count, as Veronica says in the film.
Yeah.
And I do think ultimately, again, because I look at JD as less of a character, more as, again, the id or a force of nature that needs to be controlled. And I feel like at the end of the film, Veronica essentially defeating JD is her taking control of her id. Or if you want to, read deeper into the cultural aspect of it, it's Veronica essentially realizing the moment and kind of controlling the movement as it's about to kind of come to shore.
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't know if you want to start talk because again, how I got to this was in the final image with the character of Martha and her kind of interacting with her, taking the scrunchie away from Heather Duke.
Yeah,
And
let's
almost like,
save that for the very end
yes,
because that's always a fun way to end it.
yes,
But yeah, I think that just speaking of JD, something that I really wanted to cover here was his, I don't even know if you can call it relationship, but his coexistence, his presence with his father in this movie. JD's father, that character.
yes,
One of the most fascinating and memorable dynamics that I think the movie offers to us. Certainly for me, even on the first viewing, I just couldn't stop thinking about that.
right.
I keep asking you what you think. Let me tell you what I think, and I want to get your reaction to it because there's this ambivalence that happens when these two characters are in the same scene.
Yeah.
JD, and I have to laugh because it's so outrageous and far-fetched. I've never really seen this in a movie, ever. Like the way that this is executed, right? But sometimes the father character communicates as this, like, dipshit, ne'er-do-well son. The way that he talks, like, I blew the shit out of that pretty good. And then he turns to his son and says, "What do you think about that, Dad?" Or something like that. And then the son, JD, says, "Well, that sounds real nice, son," or, whatever it is. So they
that kind of reverse dynamic.
Reverse dynamic. Sometimes it's reversed and sometimes it's not, but it
Yeah.
mostly is. And what's so fascinating about this is it's not just that dynamic and then the viewer is left like with their tongue hanging out like, I don't know
What's going on here.
Yeah, the most interesting part about it to me is that the Veronica character is an avatar for us in those moments.
Yes.
She looks at both of them like they're completely insane. She's like, what is going on here? So she's thinking exactly what the audience is. It's like he doesn't just go all in with making every aspect of the scene stylized in that kind of fixed way. He puts a different fixture in there that is the antithesis of it or challenging it. And I found that so interesting. And it did make me think that this is an essential component, speaking of her arc, of Veronica's arc. Because I do think that everything that, Adam, that you just said about blind anger and everything being essentially futile at the end of the day is covered here. Like he's coloring in between those lines here. I think he's also commentating about how behavior is passed down essentially from parents, whether they're aware of it or not. And sometimes it never leaves them. But at the same time, I think the more important thing is that Veronica has to see that an example of how this mentality, this mindset that JD has, the authority figure of that philosophy, or an authority figure that kind of is supposed to be controlling it or, restricting it or, governing it, so to speak, leading it, is just as corrupt, if not more.
Yes.
It's like you're trying to see the parent is supposed to be kind of like the superlative, the best version of the family that's kind of guiding it and is governing it in its own way. It's at the top, authority wise. And what this does is it completely obfuscates who is actually the authority figure here, right? And it turns that whole idea of hierarchy on its head, and it says, no, this blind hatred family is completely and utterly, Wild West reckless, and there is no authority to be found. It can't be traced, and they even throw in that detail about the mother, about how it was like the only thing that JD says that he loved, like, really liked or something. He liked his mother. Yeah. And then how did she die? Apparently she found her way into the building that the husband blew up. Maybe he didn't know she was in there, or maybe he did. Either way, took away the only thing that JD loved. Right. So there was no love left. There was no feeling left. To me, Adam, in conclusion, that gives us the implication that when you have a system that has a virus and is infected by hatred and cynicism and anger, blind anger especially, it renders the entire it renders all of the components of the system just emotionless and loveless. And that's why it keeps failing. It keeps getting in its own way, and it doesn't have an actual goal, because all of the goals are accidentally trapped inside that building that's being destroyed.
I just had this thought, literally, as you were saying all of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, the movie can also be interpreted as individuals who want to be made whole because something in their life is missing. Again, the Heathers function as one being, but then when one dies, that the group kind of falls into chaos. One becomes incredibly depressed, and the other one becomes megalomaniacal.
Right.
In the case of JD and the father, they lost the thing that made them whole, which was, JD's mother. When she died in an explosion that the father set off, because he's a demolitions guy. So the two of them are kind of floundering through life. Again, to your point, it's like, who's the authority in that relationship? You really don't know, because it's almost like neither of them want to take responsibility, because the thing that was the one that kind of was giving them responsibility, the one that they were beholden to, is no longer in their lives.
Right.
So as a result, they're kind of hollow now, the father and the son.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I think also why Veronica doesn't fall into that is because while, yes, her parents are kind of dullards and they're a little like kind of wet blankety.
In a very funny way.
In a very funny way. But they're still there, and they're still kind of a solid presence in her life.
Right.
She is a whole person, because not only does she have a couple of friends outside of the Heathers, but unlike JD, she does have a firm family life.
Right.
She doesn't have that emptiness. I think she's like any other teenager, just trying to find her way in the world. But there's not an emptiness to her, which is why she can see through JD's kind of act eventually.
Right. There's a core there. There's some sort of a moral compass inside there somewhere. And I think that throughout the film, again, talking about her arc, she starts to realize what that even is. Whereas at the beginning, she's just a total wet noodle that will pretty much bend however she's told to bend in order to appear a certain way, status, popularity, and so on. And in that respect, I do think that the movie really does become about in a character being able to, or acquiring the ability to take control in a sort of individual way. She doesn't actually make things happen at all in the beginning of the movie. She just stands there. She's used to write notes and to make Martha dump truck, cry and give the other a good laugh. And, she's used, and she certainly doesn't take any action and employ anything about herself. But by the end of the story, and we'll talk about this more in the final image in a second, but she does become someone that's able to take control and have an individualistic voice and take action and just not care about the wrong things, and that's such a huge part of this story. So before we go to the final image, I just have to ask, because this is it becomes such a big part of the movie. Obviously, these suicides, however satirical and silly they kind of were, they're just, I'd like to track this evolution, I guess I would call it, of how the suicides play in this society, in this story, because there's a progression, right, of the seriousness that's taken of these suicides. And then again, one of the most interesting things about the film to me is that suicide becomes something of just, a banality. It's not even a novelty anymore. It becomes pounded into just dreariness of what it actually, the presence of it, the finality of it. It doesn't feel final anymore. It's just a passing phase, right? So I just want to know what you thought that this movie is trying to say with the progression of the sort of sensationalism of the suicides in this movie. What do you think about that?
Look, the movie is broad. It paints with a very broad brush. But I also feel like the idea behind it being like suicide as teen trend is like, my God, like what's next? Like all these trends are getting so out of hand. Is teen suicide going to become a trend? Who knows? And as far as I know, because I don't have a history book in front of me, thank God it did not.
Well,
Yes,
actually,
teen is a thing.
yeah. Well,
I'm not
sorry
going
to
to downplay it.
Sure, of course, but like, sorry to cut in, but if you ever heard of this psychotic movie called Suicide Club, which is also called Suicide Circle in some circles, the Shion Sono movie, which is absolutely batshit insane. It makes this movie look like, Romeo and Juliet. That movie was apparently, I think it was like '03 or so, Suicide Club, maybe '05 or '06. That period of time was based on actual suicide trends in Japan. I think mostly in Tokyo. John Bewley would know more about this. But that movie was written as a very strong social commentary about this very large problem with teen suicides as a trend in the culture at the time. So it has happened, kind of strangely, ominously prophetic in that way, but it has happened. So yeah, no, go on. I just wanted to mention that.
All right, that's good. That's good you did.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, look, obviously the two deaths, or the three deaths rather, because it was just two people were killed at one time, were murders that were, covered up and played off like suicide. It's not until you get to Martha and to Heather McNamara that it's all of a sudden, instead of it being, oh, they're trying to rip off the cool kids, these are two very hurt people.
Yeah.
Who just genuinely are in a position where they feel that they're not loved, that, again, when you're about to commit suicide, you feel like the world would be a better place without you. And the way that the movie does handle it, in both cases, is a very nurturing kind of way. They do, yes, it's almost like the satire drops for a second. You realize, oh, wait, these people are genuinely hurt. And now all of a sudden, because it's kind of in the air, it's almost like it's become socially acceptable to do so.
Right.
And I think about, unfortunately, with Martha, it's kind of not as, prevalent. It's a couple of shots, and that's it. We haven't lived with her other than this kind of weird silent figure, the specter, kind of moving through the movie back and forth until she steps out into the road, gets hit by a bus, and doesn't show up till the end.
Yeah.
But you really feel it with Heather McNamara. Because as she puts it, when she calls into the radio DJ at that one point, and she goes under Tweety, and she's literally like, I'm cursed. One of my best friends committed suicide, and then the last guy I slept with committed suicide. Like, oh my God, is it me? Like, I'm in this horrible, horrible place. And again, that's the one Heather that really doesn't get talked to as much because, again, that character is the ego. The ego is the most boring of the three to talk about. Because the ego is essentially the self. But because she is such, she is, I guess, the one genuine Heather, I think she is allowed to be given kind of that dignity of that scene in the bathroom with Veronica, with the attempted suicide that you feel during that scene. You absolutely feel during that scene.
Yes.
And it's almost like because she's kind of come to that conclusion through that, conversation with Veronica that, she's not cursed. That there is a better way out.
Yeah.
That, again, it handles it with a depth that I appreciated. As somebody who, has dealt with, family members committing suicide in the past.
Sure.
It did handle it with a very sensitive touch that I was very appreciative of. Even if, like, yeah, sure, you did make it kind of a joke in a sense. I mean, but I get the satire behind it. You totally earned it.
Yeah, but that moment, that scene, it's different. But you're right. There's something very tonally different about that scene when she really acts and prevents the suicide.
And that's where that's where the movie earns the fact that it uses suicide as satire.
Yes.
Is because when it's actually happening, that's when the movie kind of pulls back on the comedy. Goes, wait, no, these are damaged, hurt people that
Right.
need to be reminded you are loved. The world would be worse off if you weren't in it,
Right.
and you need to kind of put your arms around somebody, and that's, I think, kind of the culmination of Veronica's arc too. Not to make it about look, not to make it about the main character there for a second, but the point being, it's when she fully re-engages with her empathy. That scene in the bathroom with Heather
Yeah.
McNamara.
Yeah. And not just like growing empathy, but acting
Yes.
on it. Again, this is a movie about characters that are, or the character that is the main character that is unable to really act and make a difference in the flow of how her little society works and functions, because she's kind of she's she's fear mongered, as we all are in our own circles in some instance. And I do think that the high school thing is just so good because it's such an extreme example of those forces working on you and working against you. The pressure to not rock the boat and to not do anything. But the movie, I think the movie remains so impressively neutral on just exactly what actions you should take, because there are certain characters that take actions that they have good intentions and it doesn't end up well, right? And there are actions that characters take that are bad intentions and it becomes fine. But I think that it says something about just act on your convictions and try and do what's right by what you know deep inside, something kind of schmaltzy like that.
Or in the case of characters like Miss Fleming, it becomes exploitative. How can I use this to better my own agenda?
Right.
In a lot of respects. And
yeah,
that's...
Speaking of kumbaya things, something that I found kind of interesting in the movie was, remember when JD, leading up to the end in the boiler room, says something, what does he say? The only place that different, factions of society can actually get along is in heaven. Right. So that's kind of, embedded in his philosophy.
But that's probably like him at his lowest and probably his least accurate conceit.
Right.
Because
but the movie's clearly countering that, though.
Yes.
And that's the nice kumbaya moment of the movie, is where you find out, along with Veronica, that no, that's really not true. Even if people aren't getting along and aren't agreeing, to think that is purely absurd, right? Like, there just has to be a way. Not every single person is a Heather. And not every single person is a Martha Dunstock, right? That bullied character, the fat girl, so to speak, that you were talking about, that we'll get to in a second, who's extremely important. There's a huge, swath of spectrum of different types of people that exist in this thing that is the society. And even though they're all swayed in a direction, like, for example, suicide becomes trendy, it's almost as if, I feel bad because I'm almost quoting JD by saying this, but it's supposed to be the right thing. There has to be some kind of leadership, right? There has to be some kind of position that's filled, even if you're just the leader of yourself. There has to be a position that's filled of influence that is not toxic.
No.
And I think, again, this movie, it's so realistic in how it deals and how it says that, because it's not saying that the answer is simple. What it is saying is that you just have to fight your ass off for it to find it, and it's going to be different for everyone, which makes group thinking very, very difficult.
And it makes it easier. At least that's how high schoolers think, and I think it's how people by and large think, where it's like, to quote the Pink Floyd song, waiting on someone or something to show you the way. That's how most people live their lives, is just they're waiting for this one entity to just come along and it's going to make everything right. It's going to make everything make sense. The problem is, you lose autonomy there. The one way to govern, is through yourself, coming from within.
Right.
And kind of bring it outwards as opposed to just looking from it from the exterior, because as we've learned from political movements, as we've learned from history, if you give up your autonomy, that usually leads to a lot of bad things happening.
Yeah.
If you give yourself over to the group, if you're looking for this external force to just fix everything, not only are you not going to find it, but eventually that force is going to end up disappointing you.
Yeah. Like all the Heathers.
Exactly.
It's the title of the movie.
Yeah.
Heathers. It's that I think that mentality is what causes all of the conflict of the movie.
Yes.
You know, I think you could even argue that I think the reason that the person at the helm becomes the new Heather is that I think there's an implication that the movie is giving me, because the strangest thing, suicide, the worst thing, becomes sensationalized and trendy. I think it's implying to us that anything could become trendy and anything could be replicated for the wrong reasons.
Correct.
Like JD's philosophy. If JD became a Heather, everyone would be talking about blowing up buildings. And that would be the new status quo.
Or would, because Veronica does have a sense of autonomy about her, and like I said, JD is just essentially a walking ball of anger, would he be subsumed by it? Like I said, this is a character who's kind of hollow. He's looking for something to fill that void.
Yeah.
Would it just be a situation where if those people were there to accept him more, would that fill that void for him?
Right.
I'm not saying that it would or wouldn't, or if that's a good thing or not, but I'm saying, would that ball of anger be channeled towards something else?
Right.
Would it be, instead of blowing up buildings, would it be making everybody else's lives miserable? Because again, at the end of the day, I don't think he's an idealist in any stretch. Quite the contrary. He's just basically an agent of chaos.
Yeah.
But you give an agent of chaos power, what do? Create more chaos. But organized chaos this time.
Right. Oh, man. Yeah. Well, I wish we were all as enlightened as Adam, because I just feel like the world would be a better place. But let's move on to just the final sequence and image in this movie.
God, what's that line? I'm just sorry. I need to just say this. What's the line from Austin Powers during the Dr. Evil speech? That sort of malaise that the genius possessed and the insane lament.
Right.
That's me in a nutshell.
All right, fine. Maybe I don't need it. So, yeah. And it's always like you read what's in the menu item and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Anchovies. I don't. Okay. Well, let's go to this final image. So basically what happens here at the very end is that, JD tries to blow up the school, of course, and then Veronica thwarts it. And she basically thinks that he's dead. She leaves the boiler room, right? She goes outside into the school steps, and he hobbles outside, and they exchange a very interesting conversation. And basically he just says, all right, well, you got me. You're more powerful than I thought you were. And it's almost like I'm going to bend the knee, and I'm kind of like my hat is off. And then what he does is he reactivates the bomb, which is now attached to him. And then he commits the only actual authentic suicide in the movie. He blows himself up right in front of her. And she seems actually pretty happy to see that. And then she turns around and she walks into the school again. And we cut to this moment where it's kind of like after everything already happened. And she's got all this like soot and everything on her, Veronica. And she just sees the new Heather. She takes her hair tie off and she puts it on herself and she kisses her kind of sarcastically and says, there's a new leader in town. Woohoo! And then she just keeps walking and kind of ignoring people. And then she sees Martha Dunstock, who they kind of very obnoxiously dub as Martha Dump Truck in the movie, who's this sort of bigger girl that's kind of like the typical high school loser. She's a doormat. No one pays attention to her. That they make fun of her at the beginning of the movie, like Adam was saying. And then it's so interesting what happens. She says, hey, do you want to hang out? See some new releases? Pop some corn, just in this very like relaxed kind of way, like the ash like falling off of her face. And then Martha says, I'd really like that. Right. And then this is kind of the wide shot of like Martha in her like wheelchair or whatever, because she tried to commit suicide herself but failed, kind of, twirling around Veronica, and they're just sort of hanging out, and then it fades to black. So what do you think about this, Adam? What's the movie saying? What's the button that it's trying to put on the end of this here?
If you're looking from the kind of the cultural stew of it, as I've been alluding to, this is the moment where Veronica kind of meets the moment, as it were. This is the moment where JD, who's been this kind of, again, wanting to be the movement, but like is too wild and crazy and takes things too far, admitting like, no, you're the right vessel for this. Her going up to Heather Duke at the end and pulling that red scrunchie off that was Heather Chandler's, and there's almost like this totem of power, and saying there's a new sheriff in town, tying her hair with it, kissing Shannon Doherty, and then going up to Martha and saying, hey, you want to hang out sometime? It shows that the old way is gone. There's a new way, and in this new way, everybody's kind of accepted, which I feel like is the mission statement of every single countercultural movement. Now, mind you, usually those movements don't live up to that kind of code. Unfortunately, eventually it gets corrupted at some point, but this is almost the start of it. This is like, you know what? The old way is gone. Reagan's gone. Bush is going to be a lame duck. The pastels are toast. The conservative mindset, the silent majority mindset is kind of starting to waver. And now it's the dawn of a new day. It's our time.
Right.
Essentially. And it's our time to write the rules. We don't have to stick to what the status quo was. The thing that our parents and our peers told us, well, this is the is what is mentality is broken, at least momentarily.
Yeah. And
that's why my whole thing was, at least culturally, this felt like the opening shot of the alternative movement that would kind of dominate the first half of the 90s and kind of sustain throughout the 90s, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analysis. Yeah, just to put a little more of a spotlight on the Martha character, I do think that whenever you have a moment like this, it screams out at me, almost like obviously again hindsight is 2020, but the answer was there all along, right? But you ignored it. Not that Martha was this, like prophet. I'm not saying that, but I think what Martha represents, the meaning of a character like that in this context, is it's almost like a government that doesn't really listen to the people. It's not really a democracy, right? It's something else. I'm not going to use any more. I'm not going to use any more words than that.
Are you saying Martha's the proletariat?
Yes, sure. Martha's the proletariat in the kleptocracy that is the Heathers. No, I mean, but again, it's this whole idea of just like you have to listen to everyone. It sounds kitschy, but every voice does matter, and that's why I love the fact that Martha ends up being the MVP of Veronica's attention, right? It's because all of the other stuff, Veronica even says at some point, like, I've seen JD's way. I've seen Miss, whatever the teacher's name is, way. Like, it all doesn't, I've seen Heather's way. It all doesn't work. Right. It's all flawed, kind of like you were just saying. But it's like, sometimes you just got to go back to the grassroots. You have to consider everything and everyone. And sometimes that seems like a very tired way to end a story or like a message to give. But I just want to say how much I love this by one moment in the movie that I thought was absolutely brilliant. I didn't notice how much I liked it the first time. The second time it walloped me and I had to watch it again 5 times. It's just a couple different shots. It's a simple sequence. Martha sitting in the gymnasium.
Yeah.
Right before she attempts to commit suicide, right? This was one of the most brilliant things of the movie to me. For film students out there, this is all visual and tells you everything you need to know about the character in 2 shots. Okay? So I think it's right after Betty leaves the croquet game with Veronica. It
Yes.
cuts to Martha, and it's a close up, and she's alone on the bleachers of the gymnasium in the school. She's sipping soda, and we hear this big like game, like basketball game or something going on, right? There's cheering, there's noise, and she's kind of looking left and looking right, Martha. And then it cuts to the wide, a big wide where you can see almost all the gymnasium, and she's completely alone. And the sound just like reverb stops and fizzles out. And we just get this very moody shot where the only light that's in the gymnasium that's really like worth a damn is just sort of like sunlight that's practically spilling in on her. And she's almost like the creature that's locked up in the dungeon or something. And then it cuts back to like a medium shot of Martha, and she seems really, really sad. Like the visual trick worked. And then she tries to take a sip, and she unfortunately dumps all of the soda or whatever all over her shirt.
Yes.
And she's completely defeated. And that's the scene. But that tells you everything about what that character's life is and what her perspective is and how she's feeling. No dialogue, just all cinematic visual brilliance. And it's so palpable, that feeling. Another rare moment in this movie, like you were saying before, where the satire drops. And it's an important beat emotionally in order to give us the idea of the perspective of this character, so that what happens to that character very soon or later is going to tie in very strongly with theme. Okay? And this connects one more degree to, do you remember when Shannon Doherty says to Veronica at some point, "Oh, did you hear that Martha dump truck tried to commit suicide and belly flopped in front of a car, and she's injured but she's okay?" And then she says something like, "Just another example of the losers trying to be like the popular people but not getting it right or failing," or something like that.
And here's the funny thing too about that too, because you mentioned before, like JD blackmailing Heather Duke.
Yeah.
He was blackmailing Heather Duke with the fact that, Heather and Martha were friends at one point, like childhood friends.
Yes.
Kind of like how Veronica kind of tossed Betty aside, Heather Duke tossed Martha aside.
Yes.
And I'll go one step further. What's the one thing that Heather Duke has that she shares with Martha? An eating disorder.
Right.
Because that gets kind of glossed over.
Yes.
Is that while Martha is clearly, obese, Heather Duke is anorexic.
Yeah.
It's almost like she fears being that. So what she do? She gave herself anorexia, essentially. I mean, not give herself. It's a serious disease. Obviously, but like the psychological effect of like having been that close to her and wanting to get as far away from that as possible. And kind of what seals her fate is when she literally gets as far away as possible. It's like, that's the thing that was used as blackmail, was her relationship with Martha. So that also feeds into, shortly thereafter, the scene in the gymnasium. Now you know the whole story.
Yeah.
She, like, again, that's, a key fundamental part of the urge to commit suicide is that feeling of absolute loneliness. Not only is her best friend gone, her best friend is literally doing everything in her power not to end up like her. She is as far as Martha knows, she is a blight on Heather's life. Yeah. And that's tragic. That's horrible. It's a horrible thought and a horrible feeling, but that makes that last shot of kind of making the friend with Veronica that much more powerful at the end.
Oh, for sure.
Because even with, again, the one line of dialogue, Martha gets the last line of the film, but we've been on this trip with her this entire time, and she's kind of, again, secretly the MVP of the film in that sense. The heart of the film, I'll say, is a better way of putting it.
Yeah, or another way, even further to put it, is everyone thought that they, wanted to be Heather, but really they didn't realize that all of them were Marthas all
Right.
along, and then the perspective changes at the end. So then being a Martha is almost tantamount to being a Heather by the end, morally,
Yes.
ethically. The value of that character is all of a sudden, she's a star at the top of the Christmas tree. And how we get there, how that happens, that's a cultural progression. That's a cultural evolution of a society. It's an enlightenment. And it's amazing to me that this, what you would otherwise think as is a cheesy, kind of corny, late 80s John Hughesy sort of movie, can do that so incredibly effectively and make us feel and just give us that idea that there are all different people that are thinking all different kinds of things about themselves and about how the authority and so on, and what's happening, like in the funeral scene where we can hear all of their inner monologues. It's hilarious. We can hear everyone's perspective and how different everyone is. But at the end of the day, we do all share something.
We do.
Right? We are locked in some sort of a proverbial cage. And what can you do? Are you going to be mean to someone and kick their ass just because you can? Or like the jocks say, oh, let's kick his ass. No, we're seniors now. We don't have to do that.
Until they're provoked.
5 seconds later. Yeah, 5 seconds later. Let's do it anyway. Yeah. Right? There's always going to be that pull and that gravity and that prodding to act in that way. Okay? But this movie, especially at the end, it's saying, no, there's actually something better. Like Adam said, there's something better out there. It's waiting for you. It's your job to go find it. It ain't going to come to you.
Life is a journey, man.
Life is a journey, dude. The fan question for this episode is, what is the funniest meaningful moment in the movie for you? What makes it funny, and why does it mean something to you? I mean, Adam and I, we tried to cover as much in the running time here as we could of just, these funny, like sarcastic mockery moments, satirical, but there's so many more that we haven't even covered. Like, there's so many conversations that we could have had. I want to just do like a series on this movie at this point. But what was your favorite one? Because there's so many, like little in-between moments and stuff. And again, always I'm the missionary trying to get this word out there. Always thinking about what it means, why it was put there, what it makes you feel, how it makes you view yourself or other people differently. What is the concept here? Okay, what does it tell us about us? And there's a lot of that here. So we would love to know on the comment threads, comment sections of whatever you're getting this podcast on, how you feel about it. We'd love to talk to you. Send us an email, SpeakingCinemaPodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram and YouTube channel, Speaking Cinema Podcast. Our TikTok, if that ever comes back, is Speaking Cinema Pod. And I want to extend the hugest and most gracious thank you to Adam Seccafico, our MVP of our own here, who keeps coming on and just blowing my mind with how awesome he is. So thank you, Adam, for coming back on and joining us to discuss Heathers.
Can't wait for the next one.
Me too, man. It's always, always, always a pleasure. And again, thank you to you guys, the listeners and viewers on YouTube. We couldn't do this without you. Please help us by sharing, following, liking the podcast. Get the word out about it however you possibly can. And we really, really appreciate that. We love the work that we do, and we do it because we're passionate, and we can feel your passion too on the other side. But we also want to hear it. So comment, let us know how we're doing, and give us some suggestions. We always post what the movie is going to be on our Instagram page about a week or so before the episode drops. So make sure that you check that out. And as always, I will see you on the next episode.